The greatest stories we can tell are the stories of our lives. Who would have ever expected that a Liverpool boy from a troubled working-class background would rise to become a founding member of one of the most influential bands in history and have his image immortalized as a worldwide icon? During World War II, Liverpool was home to the most important port outside London. Additionally, 74,000 aircraft and 4.7 million troops passed through it. German bombings over the city were sporadic in the autumn of 1940. However, the raids grew in intensity towards the end of the year. By the 23rd of October 1940, Liverpool had suffered 200 air raids, increasing to 300 by the 12th of December. Mimi phoned the Oxford Street Maternity Hospital on the 9th of October that same year and was told that her younger sister Julia had given birth to a baby boy. Mimi would later describe how she had rushed to the hospital in the middle of an air raid while dodging shrapnel from falling bombs by hiding in doorways. But records show there was no attack on Liverpool that night. The baby boy's father, Alfred, a merchant seaman of Irish descent, was not present at the birth because he was away at sea. He was named John Winston Lennon after his paternal grandfather John Jack Lennon and Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who led Britain through the war to victory. John's father was hardly around much in his early years. Alfred's first sighting of his newborn was delayed till a month after his birth during one of his short visits before he would whisk away again to work on another ship. Alfred regularly wrote letters which Julia read out loud to John, who romanticized his father as some wondrous voyager as he held onto his every written word. He also addressed paychecks to his wife at their home on number 9 Newcastle Road for some financial support, but even these would eventually end by 1943 after he was reported absent without leave by the Merchant Navy, with no clue on his whereabouts. Liverpool at the time had a bustling nightlife which boomed almost as loudly as the war. Soldiers and civilians alike would gather at the all-night dance halls to drink and dance the worries of their uncertain futures away. Freddie had encouraged her in one of his letters back in 1942 to be more sociable and outgoing, perhaps out of guilt from his long absence. Julia herself was known to be high-spirited and musical. I said to her, he would later write, "There's a war going on. Go outside and enjoy yourself," a remark he would come to regret. When Alfred eventually returned home on the 13th of January 1945, he found Julia pregnant for a man named Taffy Williams, a Welsh soldier stationed in the barracks of Mosley Hill, who she'd met on one of her many nights out. At first, she claimed she had been raped. But when Alfred and his brother Charles confronted Taffy just before the Christmas of 1945, his accounts proved undeniable that they had been lovers for over half a year. Nevertheless, Alfred accepted things as they were and offered to raise the expected child as his own, but Julia rejected. When John's sister Victoria was born, she was given away to a Norwegian Salvation Army captain due to much pressure from her family, who shuttled the newborn to Scandinavia from where she would never be heard from again. Alfred had taken John to his brother Sidney Lennon's home in the suburb of Maghall, so he was completely unaware of her birth, and by all accounts, they would go on to never be reunited. Quite soon after, Julia became involved with Bobby Dykins, a man several years her senior who was said by many around town to have plenty of charm and earn enough money to have access to tightly restricted luxuries of the time, such as chocolates, cigarettes, or liquor. And he was generous, especially to Julia. Her family, on the other hand, described him as a quick-tempered and unpredictably violent drunk who slapped her around often. Mimi, her sister, grew concerned over John's welfare in the home that they lived at, which in her opinion seemed too cramped for three, never mind the hostilities John would have to witness between the two adults. Mimi twice contacted Liverpool Social Services on account of John having to sleep in the same bed as Julia and Bobby at 1 Blumfield Road, Liverpool, where the three lived. Neglect was also a concern, as Julia devoted all her effort and attention into making her relationship with Bobby a success. It confused him and he often ran away, Mimi later revealed, detailing the times when John would turn up at her doorstep, hunched over and quaking with tears, unable to speak. And so he went back and forth from his mother and his aunt's home, with Julia often having to go collect him. John would later recall in an interview, "My mother came to see us in a black coat with her face bleeding, an instance of abuse which was only one of many." She would eventually hand over primary guardianship rights over her son to her elder sister Mimi. When June 1946 came around, Alfred arrived in Liverpool after taking some official time off work to see his son. He paid him a visit at his aunt's home where he was staying at the time, and together they went away on a seaside holiday to Blackpool. Initially, unbeknownst to everyone, it was his intention to take John away with him for good to New Zealand. John was elated at the idea of getting to join his father on a voyage when being left behind time and time again was what he was used to, only reading about Alfred's adventures sparingly in letters. It isn't clear how long Alfred had begun to set his plan in motion, but to him, New Zealand was the perfect place to make a new start. This plan was eventually thwarted, however, after Julia and Bobby arrived in Blackpool to take John back with them to Liverpool. There was an ugly standoff. Alfred made the incredulous offer to take Julia along with them, but she refused, and so he asked John, only 5 years old at the time, to choose, Mum or me. Though sources claimed this was an exaggerated version of the event, Alfred himself later recounted, "He had to decide whether to stay with me or go with her. He said me." Julia asked again, but John still said me. Julia went out the door and was about to go up the street when John ran after her. That was the last I saw or heard of him until I was told he'd become a Beatle. Upon their return to Liverpool, Julia enrolled him into a school near their home, determined to create a picture-perfect home life her son could settle into. But within just weeks, perhaps to unburden the strain of a child on her budding relationship or some other domestic disturbance within the home, John was permanently moved to his aunt Mimi and her husband George Toogood Smith's home at Mendip's 251 Menlove Avenue, Woolton, both of whom had no children of their own. There were 5 women that were my family, 5 strong, intelligent, beautiful women, 5 sisters. One happened to be my mother. My mother just couldn't deal with life. She was the youngest and she had a husband who ran away to sea, and the war was on and she couldn't cope with me, and I ended up living with her elder sister. Layla Harvey, John's first cousin on his mother's side, would claim it was Mimi and Julia's father that demanded Julia give John up, which wouldn't be unlikely as her family had applied similar pressure towards the decision of giving up her daughter Victoria for adoption, believing Julia unfit to care for her own children properly. Although it is unclear to what exact circumstance led up to this final relocation, it would last all through his childhood and adolescence. Compared to his mother, Mimi was described as strict, dignified, sensible. Instead of her lax approach to his upbringing, Mimi was a no-nonsense disciplinarian. She provided him with a middle-class home life in the 7-room stucco and brick cottage, its sunlit-filled interior and sentimental furnishings, an unobstructed golf course across the street, the familiar morning sound of hooves on the cobbled road as an old horse made milk deliveries. Pete Shotton, a friend of John, would say, "She had a terrific sense of humor which John could crack into and made her laugh in situations where she was trying to discipline him. You'd find them rolling around and laughing together." Mimi, who was a stickler for a good education and self-learning, provided John with volumes of short stories to read through, particularly the worn-out but colorful Wind in the Willow series that had been passed down from 2 cousins, which John read over and over again. He never wanted for entertainment. There were toys, coloring books, and crossword puzzles her husband George would patiently work through with him despite being a busy, quiet man of few words. He operated a dairy farm business with his brother, which had been passed down through his family for generations. Each year he'd let John bet on the Grand National when he ran a racehorse betting gig. The living room often smelled of pies and apple tarts due to Mimi's knack for baking. He was loved. They wanted John. He developed a close friendship with his cousins Stanley Perkins and Layla Harvey. Stanley, who was 7 years older, he often visited for most vacations in Scotland after a 10-hour bus ride. They would wander around Loch Maidie fishing or firing rifles with lead pellets for target practice, shooting at rabbits or bits of trash like tin cans or bottles. Stanley even taught John how to swim at the many white sand beaches they often went to. But exciting above all were the shows Stanley would take John and Layla to at the local cinemas. Sometimes as many as 3 showings a day from one screen to the next, back to back. They even traveled together as far out as Blackpool 2 or 3 times a week to visit the Blackpool Tower Circus, where performers like Dickie Valentine, Arthur Askey, Joe Loss, or Max Bygraves took to the stage, with John developing a special liking to George Formby. Education-wise, he attended Dovedale Primary School. After passing his exams in 1952, he was enrolled into the State's Grammar School, Quarrybank, from the ages of 12 to 17, where he quickly earned the title of class clown. Layla described him during this period as good-humored, easygoing, lively. But perhaps he often took things too far, as he was known to get into squabbles and cause havoc during classes. For John, who was growing to be artistically curious, this lashing out was perhaps due to the lack of mental stimulation within a rigid learning environment. It was not uncommon for him to become distracted, drawing cartoons in his books while ignoring a lecture, cartoons which appeared in the Daily Howl, his self-made school magazine. He was accused by his superiors of being completely disinterested in his studies and unfazed by threats of punishment. I was the one who all the other boys' parents would say, keep away from him. The parents instinctively recognized I was a troublemaker. I did my best to disrupt every friend's home, partly out of envy that I didn't have this so-called home. I would infiltrate the other boys' minds. I could say, parents are not gods because I don't live with mine, therefore I know. John's blossoming love and appreciation for music coincided with a deeply tragic event. It was 1955, when he was about to turn 15, that he discovered Radio Luxembourg, which broadcasted on channel 208 but somehow had a signal which beamed all the way to the United Kingdom. On weekend nights from 8 o'clock to midnight, they featured all kinds of music genres, from rock to blues, artists such as LaVern Baker, Carl Perkins, Bill Haley, the Platters, a far cry from what John was used to from the selection of musical artists popular in his corner of the map. That's the music that brought me from the provinces of England to the world, John would later reminisce. That's what made me what I am. He would jot down as much of the lyrics as he could while fiddling with the radio dial till their voices sung without a crackle through the airwaves. He'd link with his band of friends at a meet-up spot they nicknamed the Bank and mimic the music they heard, parroting lyrics they were yet too young to understand, playing the harmonica which had been a gift to John, leaning against their bikes in the grass overlooking the surrounding fields of Calderstones Park. It was embarrassing amongst his brother peers to be a boy and involved in music, and John more than anything was terrified at the prospect of being exposed as weak or girly, so the high ground meeting spot doubled as a lookout. When one of us saw someone coming, we'd drop our heads and the harmonica would disappear. With like-minded friends, he indulged in his interests, singing, dancing, practicing musical instruments, putting on performances. On the 5th of June 1955, aged 52, Uncle George collapsed and passed at his home from a liver hemorrhage. It was a Sunday. John had been away visiting Stanley in Scotland and had the news kept from him until his return. His first reaction was to burst into laughter and sob with grief in privacy. Aunt Mimi would later have to rent out the spare bedroom for an extra income. John insisted on wearing his late uncle's oversized coat as a keepsake for years after, till it became faded and tattered. Julia also visited him at Menlove Avenue often, as well as John visiting her at 1 Blumfield Road, now a little more crowded with his half-sibling sisters, Julia and Jackie. She would make the best of the allotted time they spent together, playing him Elvis Presley records, teaching him the banjo, showing him the string to Fat Domino's Ain't That a Shame. While his school results took a nosedive, his artistic skills soared. Elvis Presley especially was a significant inspiration to the young artist, like so many of his peers. Heartbreak Hotel was the most exciting thing we'd ever heard. It was the spark, and then the whole world opened up to us. It wasn't just his sound, but his looks too, which so many of the boys tried to mimic, slicking handfuls of grease through their hair in an effort to defy gravity, skin-tight jeans and sideburns. John would act out playing a guitar in the mirror like a rock star, lip-syncing and throwing poses like one, mimicking the mannerisms. At Hesse's music store in Whitechapel, he'd stare longingly at the guitars on display, but Mimi adamantly refused to purchase one for him. She was less than supportive of his musical aspirations, believing it to be an infatuation he would eventually drift away from, like he'd done with so many other interests. Julia, out of respect for her sister, who had taken on the major responsibility of her son's caregiving, laid off on undermining her authority and instead postponed the idea, saying, "Perhaps next year when you're finished with school," despite his incessant pleading. An ad in the Revel for an affordable Galatone Champion acoustic guitar of just £5 10 shillings made her crack, and she gave him the money to purchase it on the condition that it would be delivered to her home instead of Mimi's. With endless patience, they practiced together like she had when teaching him the banjo. It was a bit of a struggle learning the chords, as the guitar was a bit crummy and inferior in its build, hence the price tag, but he pushed through determinedly. Nevertheless, Aunt Mimi's reaction to all this was less than helpful. Her concern was more towards his academics, which he placed less and less effort in, causing rifts in their relationship. "The guitar's all very well, John," she once said, "but you'll never make a living out of it." When he was 16, he asked a few of his friends if they would be interested in starting a skiffle band. The original lineup consisted of John and Eric Griffiths on guitars, Pete Shotton on the washboard, Bill Smith on the tea-chest bass, Colin Hanton on drums, and Rod Davis on the banjo. Key players such as Paul McCartney and George Harrison were later additions as members left and were replaced. They called themselves the Quarrymen, and John took charge. He just knew what to do. It was right at his fingertips, Nigel Wally, a later edition, would comment. It wasn't this concept he'd worked out, it came naturally to him. The amazing thing too was how effortlessly he got everyone else to follow him. He fell into the role of lead singer, belting out lyrics during their small performances, a far cry from the shrinking and painfully insecure version of him on the bank. Many of the boys' parents worried about their association with John, considering him a bad influence, but supported the band anyway with equipment and rehearsal space due to the boys' collective enthusiasm. Julia was no exception in support. They would rehearse at her house quite often, turning up unannounced and informal. Unlike the other homes, they could be themselves, as Julia had a lax attitude with them. Julia was unlike anyone I'd ever met before, Rod Davis remembered. She acted familiar in a way that was almost flirtatious, and yet there was such a clear division in standing. She was John's mom that never strayed from anyone's mind, but her manner and the way she acted around us was more like a friend. Oftentimes they would skip school and end up at Julia's place, listening to her records in the living room, smoking cigarettes, singing and playing instruments as loudly as they pleased. Colin Hanton and other bandmates recalled, "One time I was at Mimi's when John developed a problem with some guitar chords, so it was off to Mom's. Julia immediately got the banjo out and showed him everything he needed to know. If one of the riffs got too complicated, she'd sing to emphasize what she was trying to explain. I thought, crikey, this is his mother. They're talking music." It was a lot for a lad like me to digest. At this time, he'd completely given up on school, so when his O-level results came back, it was no shock that they were abysmal. Mimi, who felt responsible for his future, pulled some strings with his headmaster William Propjoy for a letter of recommendation to Liverpool College of Art, where John had previously interviewed unsuccessfully and appealed for a redo. Arthur Ballard, who ran the interview, saw enough potential in John to endorse his entrance exam examination. When his acceptance letter came, he was nowhere as excited as Aunt Mimi, stating he would rather spend his days at a job than school. They continued performing at small gigs, as despite their attempts to be invited to more upscale venues such as the Rialto, Grafton, Pavilion Theatre, through flyers they sent out by Nigel Wally, the band manager, the responses back, if any, were lackluster. In any case, the casual venues which hosted them allowed the boys to let loose and experiment with their sound. A friend's house party surrounded by peers, a local cinema in between screenings, unpaid talent contests. Each opportunity to perform was taken very seriously by John, whose confidence on stage shined brighter than in other social situations. He was a natural. At one of their first formal gigs, a dinner dance at St. Barnabas Hall, Julian, now in her mid-40s, would for the first time witness the band's public performance. Colin Hanton would recall, between numbers, she was the only person who clapped every time, and loud. If that didn't get things going, she'd put her fingers in her teeth and whistled. She probably liked us just fine, but she would have done anything to encourage John. It would be the first and last performance of his she would ever witness. On the evening of the 15th of July 1958, months before John's 18th birthday, Julia was killed after she was hit by a car on her way home from Mimi's house. John hadn't been home that day, so she chatted with her sister instead over tea and cakes Mimi had baked. One of John's friends walked her to the bus stop, but turned around after he heard a loud thud to see her body laying about 100 feet from where she'd been hit. He ran to fetch Mimi, and together they waited for the ambulance, with Mimi crying hysterically at the scene. When a policeman turned up at the door, John went pale as a ghost, then took to Sefton General Hospital where Julia had been rushed to. He refused to view her body for identification and waited in the reception lobby, an opposite picture to the frenzied chaos around him. In Paul McCartney, a fellow member of the band, he found unspoken solace, as he had also lost his mother and knew what it was to experience such a loss at such an unusual age. He would later be quoted saying, "I lost my mother twice, once as a 5-year-old when I was moved in with my auntie, and once again at 17 when she actually physically died." Slowly he retreated into solitude and lost enthusiasm for most things, though he and Paul would routinely work on a few songs during that time, with Paul carrying most of the workload. He turned to heavy drinking, perhaps to keep up with daily living, though his friends would report that at the time he seemed to be unraveling at the seams. Some nights he would drink to levels of self-harm till he could hardly stand or form a coherent sentence. Other times the alcohol made him let loose the rage that bubbled beneath, causing him to get into random fights with strangers. This destructive drinking habit would go on for the next 2 years. John met Cynthia Powell in calligraphy class while at the Liverpool College of Art. He tapped her on the shoulder several times during class, asking to borrow a pencil, a brush, or whatever other lesson tools he needed. He spent his time fooling around, making everyone in class laugh. When I'd first looked at John, I thought, yuck, not my type, with his teddy boy look. He was different from the clean-cut boys I was used to. His outspoken comments and caustic wits were alarming. I was terrified he might turn on me, and he soon did, calling me Miss Prim or Miss Powell, taking the mickey out of my smart clothes and posh accent. But the calligraphy class soon became the highlight of her week, and when she heard John compliment a fellow classmate with hair as blonde as Brigitte Bardot, the next Saturday she dyed her hair several shades blonder. Cynthia soon ended her engagement with her fiancé from back home, John his relationship with a girl named Thelma Pickles, and the two soon began dating in the autumn of 1958, just months after his mother's passing. Their relationship was often troubled with petty conflicts, mostly due to John's irrational jealousy, which came to a head when he smacked her across the face, knocking her head against the wall, leaving her dazed and with a sore head because he saw her dancing at a party with his bandmate Stuart Sutcliffe. Their relationship ended for a while but started up again 3 months later when John eventually called her up and apologized, though he continued to be verbally cutting and unkind. Cynthia's infatuation with John distracted her from so much else in her life. Her entwining into his family, his friends, the activities around him, exciting as they were, set her back greatly in her studies, and her grades suffered for it, though she still managed to pass her exams. John, on the other hand, failed dismally and was thrown out of college before his final year. Not that he cared. To him, a degree was just a piece of paper. In August 1960, Alan Williams offered them a paid gig which involved traveling to Hamburg, Germany to play at a nightclub called the Kaiser Keller, owned by Bruno Koschmider, for 6 weeks. Alan was the owner of the Jacaranda Club, or the Jack, on Slater Street, not far from the college, and they'd often perform there along with other performers such as the Hurricanes, Rory Storm, Ringo Starr. Alan was active in the budding Liverpool music scene and even got the band gigs at other clubs. By now, they changed their aesthetic to clean-cut, all-black polo necks with jeans and going by the name Silver Beatles. They even landed a 2-week tour through northern Scotland, playing background for Johnny Gentle by way of one of Alan's connects. When Bruno Koschmider requested the band, Alan recommended the Beatles, now made up of John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Stuart Sutcliffe. They would invite Pete Best to join them on the trip as they were desperately in need of a drummer. When Mimi heard about the trip, she was horrified and begged John to take his studies more seriously. She had no idea John was even in the band, let alone one established enough to be invited abroad, but her pleas would fall on deaf ears. While away, his almost daily letters to Cynthia painted a picture of his experiences abroad. They traveled in a small van crammed with all their equipment and personal belongings. Upon arrival, he painted a graphic picture of the less than ideal situation of their living arrangements, sleeping on bunk beds in the tiny, grubby back room of a local cinema called Bambikino, using the dirty public toilets with only wash basins to bathe with. Expecting to play at the Kaiser Keller, they soon realized they'd been scheduled to play at the much smaller Indra Club instead, another one of Bruno's establishments. Up until then, they'd only ever played 1-hour sets, but were expected to perform for 7 to 8 hours per day, throwing them into the deep end where they were determined to swim instead of sink as they quickly expanded their repertoire and relied greatly on stage presence in order to appease a demanding audience who quickly warmed up to the quirky boy band. The bar soon became crowded nightly after word got out about their performances, and the closing time was extended from 12:30 to 2 a.m. They barely ate and learned to stay awake by taking slimming pills, then graduating to stronger substances further on. As luck would have it, 2 months into their stay, the Indra Club was closed down due to noise complaints, and the boys were moved to the Kaiser Keller, which offered a more spacious environment for them to perform, and their contract was extended over and over again. Despite their struggles, John seemed lit up by the whole experience as his confidence and leadership charisma grew. He'd send the bulk of his earnings to Mimi, proud that he could finally give back to her in some way. The event solidified each member's dedication to the group and became crucial to the development and quality of their sound, which improved exponentially. But soon their getaway was cut short, one member at a time, as George was discovered to be underage by the authorities to be performing in such a club and was deported back to England. After they were offered a contract with a bigger club, Paul and Pete accidentally started a fire within their accommodation during their move to better housing with the top 10. Bruno, who took their moving on as a betrayal, called the authorities and reported the incident despite the minimal fire damage, and both boys were ordered by the authorities to leave the country. John's work permit was revoked days later, and he too made the journey back to England in December 1960, followed by Stuart. But this would not be the last time they visited Hamburg, as he would go on to accept more residencies in the German city. In the summer of 1962, Cynthia discovered she was pregnant. The Beatles at the time had secured Brian Epstein, a local record store owner, who would manage them until his death in 1967, and he witnessed witnessed their transformation from a local Liverpool band to national stars. Their second trip to Hamburg in 1961 led to their first record as a backing band to Tony Sheridan, who they'd met during their first Hamburg trip as they watched him play at Top 10. My Bonnie, it was called. The boys laughed at the corniness of the lyrics and yet were still proud to have been included. It didn't sell that many copies in Germany, and hardly anyone had heard of it upon their return to the UK. Stewart chose to stay back in Germany and settle down with a girl he'd met during his first trip, Astrid, as well as chase his dream of becoming a painter after securing enrollment in the Hamburg Art College. In Liverpool, the Beatles' reputation only continued to grow, and they amassed a loyal fan base while playing regularly at the Cavern Club on Matthew Street, which had previously been a traditional jazz venue. It was here Brian first met them and decided to take on the role of managing the band after witnessing them play. Bands such as the Beatles were hired to get in line with the times and attract the large young customer base in the area. Girls all over Liverpool would sneak out of school to get a good spot in queues spiraling down the street towards the entrance of the club. The most faithful of them named themselves the Beatlettes and hung around the stage while the boys played, bringing them drinks, belting out the lyrics in unison with the band, making song requests. Cynthia herself, as well as the other girls who the boys dated, would have to keep a low profile to avoid resentful attacks with barely hushed comments like, "She's a slag. What does he even see in her?" on the way to the club restroom. Some were nice though, extending their love for the band to the girls who they publicly loved. In the total 292 times they played at the Cavern, Mimi only came to see them once, then quickly left abruptly. Her disapproval hurt John. Her repulsion at the setting was made evident, but John remained outwardly nonchalant. Brian worked to refine their image and secure bigger and better gigs, which led to an audition with Decca Records in January 1962, but their nerves dampened the performance and nothing came of it. He managed to secure them another gig in Hamburg for £40 a week, which was double their previous earnings. They flew from Manchester to Hamburg on the 10th of April, with George scheduled to arrive the following day, only to be met by Astrid upon arrival, with news that Stuart Sutcliffe had died just hours before in her arms at 4:45 p.m. after suffering from increasingly terrible migraines which often left him bedridden, yet medical checks could not pinpoint the cause. After his death, the cause upon further dissection would later be marked as a cerebral hemorrhage. John's immediate reaction was to laugh hysterically, as he often did in the face of sudden tragedy, then broke down in tears. Stuart was just 22. In early May, Brian had taken some recorded tapes to an EMI-owned HMV record shop on Oxford Street to get them made into discs, and one of the technicians was so impressed that he played the tapes to a music publisher in the upstairs office. He in turn would take it to George Martin, a producer at Parlophone. After they got the call to audition, there was an agonizing 2-month wait before they got the offer to sign with EMI Parlophone label in June 1962. "This is it, Sin," John declared. "This is it. We're going to be making records. We're famous." Pete Best was kept out of the loop. The boys wanted him out of the group. They all felt he wasn't quite right for the band, and his more reserved, gloomy personality clashed with the other members, who were more willing to have a laugh and mingle. Not wanting to do the deed themselves out of cowardice or guilt, they asked Brian to let Pete know he was dismissed. He would be replaced by Richard Starkey, also known as Ringo Starr, who they'd gotten to know in Hamburg, solidifying the classic Beatle lineup: John, Paul, George, and Ringo. "There's only one thing for it, Sin. We'll have to get married," was John's response after a long pause as he and Cynthia sat together in her little room, contemplating the weight of what a child would mean for both their futures. Cynthia would later reveal that they had no idea what contraceptions were at the time, and so never used them. "Neither of us planned to have a baby, Sin, but I love you and I'm not going to leave you now." And so it was decided. Brian wasn't too happy with John's decision, as the band's appeal to their large female fan base was the potential that they were available romantic prospects. Mimi was furious, believing that it had been a scheme on Cynthia's part to secure her place in John's life now that his career was on the rise. But he was adamant, and on the 23rd of August 1962, at a registry office on Mount Pleasant, with hardly many in attendance but the band and Cynthia's brother and his wife, they were married. Regarding the event, Cynthia would later write, "Our wedding had been a carbon copy of John's parents' wedding 24 years earlier. Julia and Fred had also married at Mount Pleasant, then gone to Reese's for lunch. They even had Mimi clicking her tongue disapprovingly in the background. I hope that their wedding had been as happy as ours was, but more importantly, that we would not part as they had." A week after signing with Parlophone, they would record Love Me Do, their first single, and it hit the charts 3 weeks after release at number 49 in the UK and gradually crept up to a peak number 17. Brian scheduled them a backing tour with then 16-year-old Helen Shapiro, a rising star. In early 1963, they released their second single, Please Please Me, after recording it in just a single day, and it would become their first number one hit in the UK on the 16th of February while they were still on tour. He would take a break to return home to see Cynthia, who was at the time lodged at his aunt Mimi's home, much to her dismay, as the two did not get along. Furthermore, she had the added pressure of having to remain a secret and hide her pregnancy from the public, so she would wear baggy clothes and scarves until it was too obvious to hide, at which point she hardly left the house at all. Coupled with that, she could no longer see the boys perform at shows or travel with John on tour, so they went stretches of time in separation. During this period, she struggled with loneliness, saying, "I was glad things were going so well for the boys, but John had been away virtually since we moved back to Mimi's. I accepted it all. It was the way things had to be. And John and I grew up at a time when it wasn't unusual for women to wait home for their men. Many Liverpool men went to sea, as John's father had, and their wives had no choice but to wait." Wanting to make a good impression on his return after so long, she went to the hairdressers to get a fresh trim, but the stylist got too carried away with how much she would cut off. When I saw it, I was horrified, and I knew John would hate it. My hair was one of the things he loved best about me. I spent the whole evening wondering what to do. That night, I put my hair in rollers so that when he came home late, he wouldn't see what had happened. But the next morning, there was no hiding it. John's reaction turned out to be not what she had expected. It was worse. She wasn't prepared for just how angry the sight of her hair length made him. He glared at her with what she described as hatred, demanding to know what she had done, then for 2 days refused to speak to or even look at her. Perhaps she reasoned to herself that with the sudden changes happening in his life, he needed her to be the one thing that remained the same. At that time, I was an anchor for John, providing a secure and stable base to which he could escape and be himself. Of all the people in his life, I was the most constant, the one that didn't demand, criticize, or give orders, the one that loved him unconditionally. Although Cynthia would deny any physical abuse from John, he himself will go on to include in the lyrics of future release Getting Better, "I used to be cruel to my woman. I used to beat her and keep her apart from the things that she loved," and expand on its meaning to Playboy magazine, saying, "It's a diary form of writing. All that I used to be cruel to my woman, I used to beat her and keep her apart from the things that she loved was me. I used to be cruel to my woman and physically any woman. I was a hitter. I couldn't express myself and I hit. I fought men and I hit women." Around this time, in fact, journalist Larry Kane, who was amongst an official Beatles press party, would narrate an event in his book, Ticket to Ride, how John had took exception to a question asked by a journalist and slapped her straight across the face. The Beatles manager Brian Epstein had to call in a ton of favors to keep the story out of the press. When their baby boy arrived into the world at 6:50 a.m. on the 8th of April 1963, he would be named John Charles Julian Lennon. John was away on tour and couldn't make it to the hospital till 3 days after the birth. Sin, he's bloody marvelous, he's fantastic, he would beam as he cradled the newborn in his arms with tears in his eyes. Who's going to be a famous little rocker like his dad then? She had to endure the birthing process alone, as Mimi would not come to visit until after the hospital called to let her know the baby boy had been born. Plus, her own mother was miles away in Canada. His presence soon attracted plenty of unwanted attention, even amongst the hospital staff, but he would leave that very same day, signing several autographs on his way out. He wouldn't be back home with them again for a week or so. When girls saw her pushing her pram around the neighborhood while running errands, they would come up to her asking if she was John's wife, and Cynthia would have to always deny it before hurrying away. It's difficult to not draw parallels between Alfred's long voyages away across seas and John's long travels away on tours for weeks at a time, almost mirroring the father figure he had so admired as a boy, pining to be whisked away to. Finally, he also had become a man and a great adventurer in his own right. When the Beatles played for the last time at the Cavern on the 3rd of August 1963, the building was so jam-packed and electric that it was clear they had become too big for the space. Their fame continued to rise with the release of singles like From Me to You in April and She Loves You at the height of summer, encapsulating the carefree era of the 60s with its catchy chorus. The two singles immediately also topped the charts, and the boys were in high demand for interviews with the British press. By the end of the year, the crazy frenzy of their fans was touted Beatlemania, which set in as they became the leading pop group in the UK. A visionary Brian had set his sights on marketing the boys to a global audience. Although they flourished in the UK, their 4 singles so far had flopped in the US, which had a more dominant worldwide media influence, so he dedicated time to mingle with big personalities within the sector. In 1964, he managed to secure an appearance for the band on the Ed Sullivan Show on the 9th and the 16th of February, when Dave Clark's 5 single Glad All Over knocked off their 5th single I Want to Hold Your Hand to number 2 just 2 months after its release in the UK. The press began murmuring that the Beatles were becoming old news. But they were in France later that month on tour when news came that I Want to Hold Your Hand had taken the number 1 spot in the US. It was this song that started their recreational use of cannabis, as when Bob Dylan listened to the lyrics of the song, he mistook the line, I can't hide, to mean I get high instead, and offered them the drink during the hangout, assuming they were seasoned smokers. She Loves You and the Please Please Me LP weren't far behind. American journalists arrived in France wanting to interview the boys, and Life magazine published a 6-page article on the British boy band from Liverpool. By the time they touched down at New York's John F. Kennedy Airport on the 7th of February, there were 3,000 screaming fans gathered there just to get a glimpse of them, wearing Beatle wigs and holding up posters with messages like, We love the Beatles, along with hordes of police officers working hard to prevent a surge. Over 50,000 people had applied for the 700 tickets to their upcoming appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show. At every press conference, the boys, as usual, answered each question with disarming wit and charming snark, which captured the hearts of the American audience. When asked about their upcoming film, A Hard Day's Night, and who would be playing the leading lady, George cheekily responded, We're trying for the Queen. A record-setting 73 million people tuned in that evening to the Ed Sullivan Show, making it a major moment in television history. 60 years later, people still remember exactly where they were the night the Beatles stepped onto the Ed Sullivan stage. They continued to tour the US, appearing at iconic venues such as the Washington Coliseum and Carnegie Hall. They even accepted a dinner party invitation from the British ambassador. Letters and cards and gifts were constantly delivered to their hotel suites. The phone rang non-stop. Even a telegram came in from Elvis. They had well and truly conquered the American American market and surpassed their wildest expectations. Back in the UK, they set about completing A Hard Day's Night, which was released in album format on the 6th of July 1964 in the UK and in film format days after on the 10th. The album was a commercial success, topping charts in the UK as well as the US, and is now notable for being the first Beatle album to feature only Lennon-McCartney compositions. Many of the songs had a reoccurring theme of isolation, perhaps reflecting the averse symptom of living as such public figures and being cut off from people and even places they had so casually attended as children, having to depict an image that often clashed with the everyday realities of their lives, shuttling from one appointed spot to the next while dodging fans gathered at break spots cloaked in all manner of disguise. Tracks such as If I Fell and I Should Have Known Better in particular showcase John's distinctive voice and songwriting skills. The film released after was directed by Richard Lester and offered a playful, fictionalized glimpse into a day in the life of the band. Actors such as Norman Rosenting and Wilfred Ramble, who played Paul McCartney's fictional grandfather, added to the film's comedic elements. It was also a critically acclaimed success, influencing the development of music videos and rock musicals. That same year, he would also publish In His Own Right, his first book. It was a collection worked on over several months of whimsical stories, poems, and illustrations which showcased his unique sense of humor. John had always had an interest in writing, an interest nurtured from when he was a boy in Aunt Mimi's home, or perhaps it started even earlier with his father's letters, which were very much like pages from a fantasy series. Reading anything and everything, jotting down short stories of his own, rhymes, and even a doodle here and there were habits he had maintained. So when an editor from Jonathan Cape Publishing House got a glimpse, he brought up the idea of publishing a book if John could create a larger body of work. The prospect of seeing his very own book on a shelf would be a dream come true for him. Upon release, it sold 40,000 copies on the first day. Its scrappy, haphazard construction within a mere 78 pages appealed to the alternative culture of the time, which valued diversion from literary snobbery. There's nothing deep in it, he'd tell the press. It's just meant to be funny. Times Literary Supplement said, it's worth the attention of anyone who fears for the impoverishment of the English language and the British imagination. The BBC called it a laugh a minute. With the success of his first book, he would go on to publish A Spaniard in the Works the following year. At fancy literary conferences he was invited to, he always kept speeches required of him to no more than brief one-liners, much to the annoyance of the respected audience in attendance, a gesture which became mistaken as an intentional snub to the establishment, but those close to him would reveal that it was out of sheer terror on his part, intimidated to be in the midst of so many literary giants. He felt completely out of his depth. In the 1960s, no pop star had ever received the award of membership to the Order of the British Empire, or MBE for short. So when the Queen made the announcement and announced the Beatles with such an honor, there was jubilation as well as much uproar. I am so disgusted with the Beatles being given this award that I'm considering sending mine back, protested an elderly Coast Guard decorated for his bravery. The boys who from working class backgrounds had no idea what the title even meant were just as split on the offer, with John later saying, I was embarrassed. We all met and agreed it was daft. Yet not for a moment did they consider turning it down. In the midst of all the ruckus, they continued working at new material such as upcoming film and album Help. The film would be released first on the 29th of July, followed by the album on the 6th of August. John would reveal years later that the album was inspired by the deep depressions he faced during the band's rise to fame. I was fat and depressed and I was crying out for help. In a letter to Cynthia dated August 23, 1965, while away on tour following the album release, he would write, I think it's been a slow process, my feeling like a father. I spend hours in dressing rooms and things thinking about the time I've wasted not being with him and playing with him. He doesn't see enough of me as it is, and I really want him to know me and love me and miss me like I seem to be missing you both so much. I'll go now because I'm bringing myself down thinking about what a thoughtless bastard I seem to be. And it's only sort of 3 o'clock in the afternoon and it seems the wrong time of day to feel so emotional. I feel like crying and it's stupid. And I'm choking up now as I'm writing. I don't know what's the matter with me. It's not the tour that's so different from other tours. I mean, I'm having lots of laughs, but in between the laughs, there's such a drop. There are almost no in-between feelings. And yet, when he returned home to his wife and son, he remained distant, crashing from exhaustion, sleeping for days. Cynthia reported that at times he was even hostile, writing, "John loved being with his son, but in short bursts. His moods were unpredictable and at times he was intolerant and impatient with Julian. On one occasion, I remember him shouting across the dinner table because Julian was eating messily. I was livid and I stormed, 'If you were here more often, you'd realize that this is how boys of 3 eat.' Around this period, his interest deepened in hallucinogenic acids, namely LSD, which wasn't even illegal at the time and had little to no buzz on the streets. He was introduced to it by John Riley, a prominent dentist who had gotten it from the manager of a Playboy club. It was pure and it was potent. The acid was slipped into his coffee on sugar cubes by host John Riley while visiting him at a dinner party in his home, accompanied by Cynthia, George, and his girlfriend Patty. They'd felt a general sense of unease around the dentist, who was notoriously known for tales of debauchery involving numerous forms of sex acts, often in groups. Soon after their meal, they began to feel odd. Cynthia would be quoted saying, "We had no idea what was going on until our laughing host enlightened us. We were all so frightened that we rushed straight out of the house, desperate to get home." The experience had been traumatic for Cynthia, but John's interest was piqued. Although he'd been as scared and shocked as the rest of us, he was also fascinated. What for me had been the end was for him only the beginning. In fact, it became a regular recreational drug for all members of the Beatles, but John especially indulged daily with reckless abandon, going as far as to credit the substance as a major source of creativity and enlightenment. Yet this dependence only strained his marital relationship with Cynthia, who already had to cope with the distance created by his constant touring, interviewing, or recording. When John was tripping, I felt like I was living with a stranger. He would be so distant, so spaced out that he couldn't talk to me coherently. I hated that it was pulling him away from me. Bringing people home he'd met after a clubbing session while under the influence became a regular occurrence, which distressed Cynthia, who would wander downstairs only to be met by the sight of glassy-eyed strangers lounging around her home, rummaging through the kitchen for food, sometimes staying for days on end. Our home was being invaded by people I neither liked nor wanted to know. I was afraid for Julian and myself. I didn't want to hear loud music all night or pick my way through semi-conscious bodies when I brought my son down for breakfast. But every effort I made to put an end to it was met by a brick wall. It was also around this time that John's father, Alfred Lennon, attempted to reunite with his son after having abandoned him to his fate for over 20 years. Apparently, he'd had no idea of John's success, but while working as a kitchen porter at the Greyhound Hotel in Hampton, a colleague pointed out John's face in the newspaper and asked if John was related to him. The boy he'd left behind in Liverpool was now a star, a millionaire, and reconnecting became a priority. Alfred would turn up to John's dressing room on the set of Help during filming after recruiting newspaper reporters to capture the reunion of a Beatles star to his long-lost father, but was unsuccessful as all he encountered was rejection and anger from John. He would visit John's family home at Kenwood, hoping to speak to him, but he was often not around. John's icy exterior would soon melt enough for him to at least be on speaking terms for some time before his father's death, but he always remained guarded and suspicious that Alfred was only around for what he could get out of him. The band's most controversial event also took place that year when they featured in an interview by Maureen on the London Evening Standard. In the habit of never shying away from speaking his mind, regardless of who it offended, John, perhaps even more at ease due to the interviewer being a friend, would go on to state, "Christianity will go, it will vanish and shrink. I needn't argue about this. We're more popular than Jesus now. I don't know which will go first, rock and roll or Christianity. Jesus was alright, but his disciples were thick and ordinary. It's them twisting it that ruins it for me." The quote, which went unnoticed in England, was then picked up by American media after it was first republished by US magazine Data Book, and within days set up an overwhelming uproar against the Beatles, going as far as their music being banned across American radio stations and organizations like the Bible Belt responding with outrage. Then, with America's media power, it wasn't long before John started receiving an outpouring of hate mail from people all over the world. The release of Help that year was almost as much of a success as A Hard Day's Night. They followed up on the release by touring Germany, Japan, the Philippines, and North America, which featured their last ever public concert on August 29, 1966, at Candlestick Park in San Francisco, California. Despite the controversy, each show sold out, and John, completely out of character, made a public apology at the start of the tour. When it was over, they would take a well-deserved break from public performances and devoted themselves to studio work on a more laid-back schedule. Each Beatle member pursued different interests during their break, spending more time with family or traveling across Africa and Asia. For John, who enjoyed working on the past two films released by the band in addition to their albums, happily took on a role in anti-war movie How I Won the War, filmed in Germany and Spain. In it, he played the role of Private Gripweed, who was a character who wore a pair of national health glasses with small round spectacles in a thin wire frame. John, who struggled with the use of contact lenses which at the time were made of uncomfortably thick glass, took a liking to this wardrobe choice, and it became a staple in his look going forward. He loathed the endless waiting in the desert, revealed Ray Coleman, and learning lines, however short, drained his patience. John himself, regarding the experience, would be quoted saying, "It was pretty damn boring for me. I didn't find it at all fulfilling. The charm of living as a film star, or in this case, a supporting actor, wore off quickly, and he soon returned to music." During that period of rest and exploration, he read about a Japanese artist who really amused him. In her book, John, published 2005, Cynthia marked an introduction to the final catalyst which would lead to the eventual collapse of their marriage. "I was glad he was being creative, but his taking hadn't stopped, and too often he was lost to me. One morning at breakfast, he pointed out an article in the newspaper. It was about a Japanese artist, Yoko Ono, who had made the film that consisted of close-up shots of people's bottoms. "Sin, you've got to look at this. It must be a joke. Christ, what's next? She can't be serious." We laughed and shook our heads. We had no understanding at all of avant-garde art or conceptualism at that point, and the newspaper went into the bin. We didn't discuss Yoko again until one night when we were lying in bed reading. I asked John what book it was. It was called Grapefruit. "Oh, something that weird artist woman sent me," he said. Apparently, he'd gone to her exhibition after an invitation from gallery owner John Dunbar, ex-husband to Mick Jagger's ex. Dunbar personally made the introduction between the two. Regarding her first impression of John, Yoko would later tell The Independent, "He was this macho guy. I was observing him and I wasn't impressed at all." Though her stature was small in a black leotard highlighting her pale skin, she had an overpowering aura. John surprisingly found himself visibly flustered in Yoko's presence. "Well, what's the event?" he asked as casually as he could while glancing around, buying time to regain his composure. Yoko, without a word, simply handed him a card with the single word "breathe" on it. He liked her sense of humor. Yoko is said to have been particularly persistent in her pursuit of John since the first day they met at the Indica Gallery show of November 1966, though she vehemently denies having known who he was, his status of fame, or his involvement with the Beatles. While she wrote him several letters and made many phone calls to their Kenwood home, Cynthia continued to assume Yoko was just one of John's more favored fans. Regardless of their communication, Cynthia said, John read her letters and left them lying around, so nothing seemed suspicious. She had no idea Yoko had visited their home again and again looking for John, sometimes standing outside the gates among the horde of desperate fans hopeful to get his attention. That year, the Beatles performed All You Need Is Love as Britain's contribution to the Our World satellite broadcast before an international audience estimated at up to 400 million. They released Strawberry Fields Forever and Penny Lane, both of which were named after places John and Paul had frequented in Liverpool growing up. Although both singles were considered a failure in comparison to their earlier chart-topping hits, the continued work during their hiatus soon paid off with the album release Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which is hailed today as a masterpiece. In it, the influence of LSD is more evident in its psychedelic sounds and surrealist lyrics, particularly Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. It was the height of the flower power hippie era, with peace and love and in abundance, in vogue miniskirts, love beads, and long flowing tresses. Journalist Ray Coleman, who attended the album launch party, expressed concern at the sight of John, who looked haggard and ill, with slurred speech and glazed over eyes as he continued to puff away and down shot after shot. Perhaps it was due to the drastic fall into and its growing effect taking root in him, which caused those around him who cared for John to be more accepting and indulge his sudden interest in Indian spiritual beliefs. The sudden craze of the summer was Hinduism. Newlyweds George and Patty were first to fall into the craze and invited John, Paul, Jane, and Ringo to come along to a conference in Bangor, North Wales, where the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi would be given a seminar on transcendental meditation. John loved it so much, and they as a group were so taken by the Maharishi's charisma that they accepted his invitation to his 10-day Bangor conference starting from the August bank holiday weekend. While there, they composed most of the songs for an upcoming double album, The Beatles. John cut down drastically on following the encounter, parroting the Guru's words about enlightenment and divine awareness. One of the Maharishi's messages was that meditation could provide a high as intoxicating as any drug. So of course Cynthia, who felt his addictions were driving a wedge in their marriage, was all too happy to come along to the conference for support. And in addition, John, Paul, Ringo, George, Magic Alex, Patty, and Jenny, her sister, made up the group. Following the introductory seminar, the Beatles held a press conference denouncing use, but as they headed back to their hostels, a reporter shockingly announced breaking news which caused all color to drain from John's face, that Brian Epstein, their manager, had been found dead at just 32. To John, grief had always been served so abruptly, but try as he might, he could never quite get the hang of dealing with it, always keeping his emotions bottled up, letting it out in hints of light-hearted sarcasm and flashes of rage. Brian had been like a brother, a mentor, even somewhat a father figure. In the 6 years John and the rest of the Beatles had known him, which felt like decades due to the astronomical changes they had experienced, he had orchestrated their monumental monumental growth from a small local boy band to international stars, helped organize their marriages, congratulated them into fatherhood. Their Christmas film and album Magical Mystery Tour was their first project without Brian, which turned out to be their first flop, with critics knocking it for lacking plot or direction. John would later be quoted saying, "I knew we were in trouble then. I didn't have any misconceptions about our ability to do anything other than play music. I was scared. I thought, we had it now." With Brian gone, it seemed members of the group found a new mentor in the Maharishi, going as far as to visit his ashram at the foot of the Himalayas in Rishikesh, India in February 1968 and staying there for months. It was during the preparations for the trip and a visitation to the Maharishi's assistant in London that Cynthia was able to meet Yoko in person. A raven-haired woman dressed in black from head to toe emerged from the shadows and confidently requested from John a lift back to the city. Cynthia noticed a look of pure shock flash across his face before he introduced her. Yoko had been amidst their early gathering as they discussed and finalized travel plans. All the while she remained mute and motionless in an armchair off to the corner of the room. John appeared to not notice her the whole time, while Cynthia racked her brain wondering if he had personally invited her. He must have. This stranger didn't seem so innocent after all. And why had John made such a show of undermining the depth of their relationship? Her book, Grapefruit, had remained on his nightstand, but he'd said to her flippantly, yet almost an assurance, "She's just a weirdo artist who wants me to sponsor her. Another nutter wanted money for all that avant-garde bullshit. It's not important." I loved being in India, away from the stresses and pressures of our lives. Here, there were no fans, no hordes of people, deadlines, demands, or flashing cameras, just peace. Quiet and sweet mountain air filled with the scent of flowers. Best of all, John and I could be together for much of the time. I hoped we would meditate together, grow in mutual understanding, talk, go for walks, and rediscover our lost closeness. But her expectations couldn't have been further from their reality. The trip only served to expose the chasm in their marriage, with John remaining cold and aloof, even requesting that they get separate rooms only a week into the trip, then practically ignoring her existence for the rest of it. To her plea for an explanation of his attitude, he'd respond, "I'm trying to get myself together. It's got nothing to do with you. Give me a break." Later, she would learn that Yoko had written him almost daily while they were away, and each morning he would rush down to the post office to retrieve her letters. Their trip was cut short when the group started questioning the Maharishi's character and intentions after he was accused of being inappropriate with a young American girl, a fellow foreigner in attendance. For a man who claimed to be spiritual, his fascination with celebrities and material things seemed unusual. On their return to London, the Beatles became increasingly involved in business activities with the formation of Apple Corp., a multimedia corporation composed of Apple Records and several other subsidiary companies. It was a venture aimed at giving them greater control over creative output and venturing into various entertainment industries. Lennon described the venture as an attempt to achieve artistic freedom within a business structure. Marriage-wise, he remained as distant as ever, with Cynthia growing hopeless and depressed about the future of their marriage. On a day as average as any other, he turned to her and confessed that he had been unfaithful many times. Perhaps, eager to be hopeful, she mistook his bluntness for warmth, an attempt to clear his conscience and make things better. The release date for the Beatles' new project, White Album, was quickly approaching, and John insisted Cynthia take some time out for herself and go on a 2-week trip to Greece that they had intended to go as a couple, along with other close friends. He, on the other hand, stayed back to compose songs. Julian was left in the care of their housekeeper, Dorothy. Unlike John, Cynthia came from generations of stable families who stuck it out for good, which explained her stubbornness determinedness at working on her own marriage against all odds. She'd said her vows and she meant it. A separation to her was inconceivable. All this would change, however, when she returned home to Kenwood tanned and cheerful from the 2-week holiday with Jenny and Alex in tow, who had insisted on coming over to have dinner with John included. Cynthia had called home and spoken to John to let him know she would be home soon. When the group of 3 arrived, the front door was unlocked. The lights were on, but the curtains were drawn and everywhere was silent. When she swung open the sunroom door and peeked into the dimly lit room, she found John lounging on the floor with Yoko in her own robe intimately cross-legged beside him. "Oh, hi," John called out, looking at her as if she was the stranger, the intruder in her own home. It must have been the shock, or perhaps she'd grown so used to pretending that it becomes second nature, because in response she simply blurted out, "We were all looking forward to dinner in London after lunch in Rome and breakfast in Greece. Would you like to come?" Yoko, with her back to her, never once turned around. Surely this must have been intentional. He'd known she was on her way back to the house, the final nail in the coffin to drive the message home. "No thanks," was his response, served cold and indifferent. Cynthia turned around and fled. Soon they were taking pictures together out in public, Yoko and John. Cynthia knew when she opened an Italian newspaper while away abroad and saw them arm in arm that it was well and truly over. John would never take Yoko out in public if he wasn't ready to file for divorce. The press descended on the scandal. Word had circulated through the channels that John's marriage was over, recalled Don Short, and everyone was waiting for the chance to uncover it. Word came from John demanding a divorce on grounds of adultery with his friend Magic Alex the night she discovered Yoko with him, an accusation Cynthia denied. She would go on to initiate an official divorce filing on the 22nd of August 1968, citing John's infidelity with Yoko as the primary reason. It was granted on the 8th of November, with Cynthia receiving custody of their son Julian and a financial settlement. The press sympathized with her as the scorned, doting wife who was discarded. John was painted as a callous and insensitive husband and father, but Yoko took the brunt of it all, with headline remarks about her tinged with racist and misogynistic undertones. The 7-year age gap between them, and Yoko being the older of the two, cast their relationship in an even more abnormal light, with Yoko taking on more burden of responsibility as the manipulative, controlling figure behind all of John's publicly unfavorable decisions. Her daughter Kyoko Chan Cox and husband Anthony Cox, whom she would be divorcing on the 2nd of February 1969 to marry John the month after, were also thrown into the spotlight. Maybe it was due to the pressures around them at this time, which would trigger the couple's escapist dependence on her. Paul McCartney would later explain, he was getting into harder than we'd been into, and so his songs were taking on more and more references to her. He suspected John was introduced to the substance by art dealer Robert Fraser upon release from prison on a charge before they went away from Maharishi's ashram retreats, a habit which grew progressively worse upon his return to the UK, where he started using with Yoko. Lennon's B-side Revolution, which was released amid the 1968 protest and contained strong political undertones, was the band's debut single for the Apple label. It would have to be re-recorded again and again due to John's increasing lack of focus or coherence, leading to ridicule from political radicals in the New Left press for its pacifist messaging. With each take, Yoko remained at John's side, listening, which was a shock for everyone else, as it was practically forbidden for outsiders to gain access to the studio and watch them work. A golden rule. Even their late manager Brian had limited access to the studio when he was alive, yet none of them challenged John, intimidated by his easily triggered volcanic mood swings, unnerved by his hallucinations, annoyed with his incoherent lyrics. We were all trying to be cool and not mention it, but inside we were all feeling it and talking in corners, was Ringo's version of events. She just moved in, George recalled, although he would clearly state during an interview with Dick Reykjavik caveat. No, the group had many problems before Yoko came along. Many problems. When asked by The Independent about entering into a relationship with John, Yoko replied, "The main thing that made me hesitate was his entourage, as it was clear they hated me. I thought hard about whether I wanted to get into that situation, but we had so much in common, which was odd because he was from Liverpool and I was from Tokyo. We simply thought the same about things. Love won. There wasn't anywhere he went that she could not follow or would not follow, even tagging along behind him to the restroom as the others watched in amazement. Determined to make her presence known, Yoko would even grab John's mic during tapings and moan into it, throwing out random words and sentences into the mix. She critiqued playbacks of their work, decided which takes to discard, even the ones everyone else voted to keep. John, on the other hand, was offended at the group's coldness towards Yoko, demanding that they treat her as a fellow artist and musician in collaboration, arguing, why should she take that kind of shit from those people? The White Album, which was released on the 22nd of November, would contain several references to Harry, particularly the song Everybody's Got Something to Hide Except Me and My Monkey. A monkey on the back was the term it was popularly known as back in those days. It contained lines like, the deeper you go, the higher you fly, but John would outrightly deny the many ties to the substance, claiming, that was just a sort of nice line I made into a song. It was about me and Yoko. Everyone else seemed to be paranoid except for us two, who were in the glow of love. The loved-up duo's collaborative projects were often quirky, experimental, and very much in line with Yoko's artistic flair, such as the Unfinished Music No. 1 Two Virgins album, featuring a naked cover photo of the two, which drew much attention, but not so much its musical content. A 1968 Christmas special at the Royal Albert Hall saw them musically perform and hold a press conference from inside a large white bag. On the 20th of March 1968, they were married in Gibraltar Island, surrounded by an expanse of dreamy turquoise water. There, they spent just over an hour in total, swearing affidavits and purchasing a marriage license from the British consulate within minutes. Even in a place so remote, they were still hounded by photographers and fans upon arrival, though they did not make much of an effort to be inconspicuous in their all-white ensembles. To the journalist who surrounded their departure plane back to Paris, John would say, intellectually we didn't believe in getting married, but one doesn't love someone just intellectually. For two people, marriage still has the edge over just living together. Just days after, they moved to Amsterdam and held the famous week-long Weddings for Peace anti-war protest at the Hilton Hotel, where they gave several interviews. Knowing they would not be able to have a proper honeymoon without the press interruption, they decided to make themselves willing spectacles on behalf of an honorable cause, with John explaining, instead of fighting it, we joined it. Whether day or night, 60 journalists at a time were allowed access into a room decorated with hand-painted sign slogans. John loves Yoko, hair peace, stay in bed, grow your hair, and the favorite, give peace a chance. The TV broadcast of the event would be the first time his son Julian had seen John since his parents' bitter divorce was settled. John's biographer, Ray Coleman, would go on to speculate that perhaps there was some element of self-serving behind outwardly noble intentions for John. With the Beatles at crossroads, his newfound passion for heavily media-covered protest gave him a platform to maintain his public power and image. At a conference in Amsterdam, John would reveal in his own words, placing himself on par with the messianic figure once again, we are trying to make Christ's message contemporary. What would he have done if he had advertisements, records, films, TV, and newspapers? Well, the miracle today is communications, so let's use it. Work had begun on songs for the Let It Be album in January 1969, originally titled Get Back, which aimed at capturing the Beatles' return to live performance. The aim was to record each track live without studio effects and accompany it with a documentary-style film capturing the whole process. But the project languished as personal and professional conflicts took precedence over its development. George Harrison at one point temporarily left the group due to creative differences. The live performance elements culminated into the famous rooftop concert on the 30th of January 1969 atop the Apple Corps building in London. This impromptu gig and the Beatles' final public performance included memorable renditions of Get Back, Don't Let Me Down, and I've Got a Feeling. After a brutal mass firing within the corporation's management and administrative team, Alan Klein was appointed as Apple's chief executive by all members of the Beatles except Paul, who never signed the management contract in protest to Klein's fee, which he considered exorbitant, accusing him of having the ulterior motive to deceive and milk them financially. This would set off a series of lengthy legal battles within the company, becoming the catalyst for the eventual separation of the band. Amidst the negotiations, John and Yoko launched a second album, Unfinished Music No. 2, Life with Lions, featuring a track made up of Yoko's miscarried fetus's heartbeat. What they seemingly lacked in direction, they made up for in shock factor. John at this point had grown his hair long and unkempt with a skeletal frame and often appeared sickly from all the hair ingestion. He was offered a role as Christ in upcoming movie Jesus Christ Superstar by producers Andrew Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice, but he ended up not going ahead with it as he refused to let Yoko play Mary. Ringo told NME magazine, "I don't know what people think of John at the moment. I know a lot of people in Liverpool are saying he's gone off his head." Days after the Beddings for Peace protest, John announced he would send 2 acorns to the head of states in every country of the world so they could plant trees instead of bombs. On the roof of Savile Road, amongst a small gathering, John announced he would be changing his middle name from a patriotic Winston after Winston Churchill to Ono as a protest to the gender norm of wives taking the last name of their husbands. Yoko changed her name for me. I have decided to change mine for her. One for both for each other. That year, in a final attempt to return to the simpler ways of their former days, amidst the mayhem which had taken root in the Beatles' empire, the boys dusted off abandoned lyrics scribbled in notebooks and half-done recordings to breathe new life into and create something new but reminiscent of their classic sound. George and Paul recalled, "We decided, let's make a good album again. A Beatles album like we used to." They would title it Abbey Road and release it in September. Till date, it stands as one of the Beatles' most iconic and critically acclaimed albums, featuring the iconic photograph of the boys crossing the zebra crossing outside Abbey Road Studios on its album cover, marking the last time all 4 Beatles would record together as a cohesive unit. It featured classics such as Come Together, Here Comes the Sun, and Something. The week before the album's release, John announced his decision to leave the Beatles to the other 3 members and manager Alan Klein during a private meeting in London, but they agreed to keep this private until pending negotiations were completed. Critics were skeptical upon the release of Abbey Road on the 29th of September 1969, but it quickly gained widespread acclaim plus commercial success, topping charts around the world, and is today cemented as a masterpiece, a fitting swan song for the Beatles' recording career together. By the end of 1969, John hardly socialized or attended meetings with the rest of the band. Anyone beyond his relationship with Yoko and their dependence on became less and less significant. Even his relationship with his son Julian suffered, despite his attempts to arrange visitations to his and Yoko's new home. Although Cynthia expressly states that Julian never reported cool-mannered Yoko of being unkind in any way during his stay, his father, on the other hand, would be a completely different matter. She revealed, it seemed that John sometimes had angry outbursts towards him, shouting at him for the way he ate or being too slow, which made him nervous. He was afraid of provoking John, who switched very quickly from playful to furious. John also did not bother himself with the complex legal proceedings or ongoing negotiations within the Beatles company Apple. All four members had by this time sold their remaining shares in their management company founded by Brian Epstein to Triumph Studios in order to each assert more control over individual business operations. John and Yoko formed Plastic Ono Band and released their first title, Give Peace a Chance, which was widely adopted as an anti-Vietnam War anthem. It was a huge hit. The pair took over billboards in 11 world cities declaring, "War is over if you want it," then cut their long, overgrown hair and auctioned it off in the name of peace. In protest against Britain's connection to the Nigerian Civil War, as well as its support of America in the Vietnam War, John returned his MBE medal to the Queen, though this title status remained unchanged as only the sovereign has the power to annul the original award. In October, the pair released the wedding album, which was a lavishly decorated box set of mementos from their marriage, along with 2 tracks, one of which was a 22-minute recording of them shouting each other's name from a soft whisper to a roar. In a shocking turn of events, Paul would go on to publicly announce his departure from the Beatles and the disbandment of the group in April 1970 at the launch of his debut solo album, McCartney. John, who felt Paul had been trying to claim the leadership or star role of the group in its final years, was upset he had beaten him to it. "We got fed up with being sidemen for Paul. After Brian Epstein died, we collapsed. Paul took over and supposedly led us. But what is leading us when we went round in circles?" John would also be quoted saying, "I started the band, I disbanded it. It's as simple as that." He'd tell Rolling Stone magazine 8 months later, "I was a fool not to have done what Paul did, which was to use it to sell a record." The Let It Be album was finally released amid the announcement of their breakup. For almost half the year in 1970, John and Yoko booked a primal therapy session with Arthur Janov, first in California and then continuing at their Tittenhurst Park estate in England. The intense psychotherapy aimed to release repressed childhood traumas through cathartic expressions such as crying and screaming. The therapy profoundly impacted John, helping him to confront deep-seated emotional pain from his mother's death and his father's abandonment. This emotional exploration significantly influenced his music, leading to the raw and honest debut solo album John Lennon / Plastic Ono Band, released on the 11th of December 1970. Many of its tracks would explore John's childhood traumas, including a personal favorite of mine, Mother. No amount of explanations here can do it justice. It deserves to be listened to. I'll leave a link to it in the description bar or a pop-up on the screen. Critics praised the body of work, but it was a highly personal project with niche sounds which limited its commercial success. For his next album, Imagine, he aimed for more mass appeal and was successful. The title track, Imagine, co-written by Yoko, with lyrics envisioning a world without war, borders, or religious divisions, became an anthem for anti-war movements. Jealous Guy addresses his insecurities and regrets in past relationships with women. The album is regarded as his most successful and critically acclaimed solo work. John's political involvements would only grow now that he only had his image to bear responsibility for instead of for. In 1971, when he and Yoko moved to New York, they became very involved in the US radical left, influenced by the counterculture movement movement and the political climate of the late 1960s and early 1970s, John became increasingly vocal about his opposition to the Vietnam War and his support for various social justice causes. He befriended fellow activists such as Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin of the Youth International Party, or Yippies for short, and supported causes like the Black Panther Party, as well as the plight of Native Americans. He participated in protests, benefit concerts, and public speeches. A notable example was the Free John Sinclair concert in December 1971, helping draw attention to the case of Sinclair, a radical activist and leader of the White Panther Party, who was imprisoned for possession, contributing to his release soon after. His political engagement culminated in the 1972 album Sometime in New York City, a collaboration with Yoko and New York band Elephant's Memory, which addressed women's rights, the Attica prison riots, the Irish Troubles. It also featured controversial Woman is the of the World, in which John compared sexism to racism. It peaked at number 57 in the US, and his repetitive use of the N-word led to most American radio stations declining to play the record on their airwaves, while media establishments such as Rolling Stone, Record World, the AV Club, and Classic Rock praised the song's boldness. Characters such as author Todd Mealy critiqued John's use and adamant defense of the song as a lack of nuance and empathetic knowledge on the oppression of people of African descent. Acclaimed Ta-Nehisi Coates questioned whether John and Yoko really had any understanding of what it meant to be a John's political activities drew the attention of the Nixon administration in 1972, who viewed him as a potential threat. The FBI began monitoring his movements, going as far as tapping his phone, while the government initiated deportation proceedings against him based on a 1968 cannabis conviction in the UK, kicking off a legal battle that would drag on for 4 years. The immigration authorities denied him permanent residency in the US, and it would not be granted until July 1976. On August 1972, John and Yoko organized 2 benefit concerts at Madison Square Garden, performing alongside Elephant's Memory and special guests to support patients at the Willowbrook State School mental facility. The concerts, known as the one-on-one shows, were his last full-length concert appearances. When George McGovern, who John saw as a hopeful candidate to end the Vietnam War and advance social justice, lost the election to Richard Nixon, it was a huge blow. Apparently, this led to him getting drunk during his post-election wake at activist Jerry Rubin's home in New York, which he and Yoko attended. In Yoko's own words, John was staggering around and he went into another room. There were only 2 rooms and the walls were very thin, and he started making love to a woman. It was very loud and someone was kind enough and tried to turn up the music, but it was Bob Dylan and he's pretty quiet. Yoko quickly left the scene embarrassed. Unlike his former wife, who was more willing to look the other way, the incident not only inspired her later song Death of Samantha, but their temporary separation the following year. Despite his pleas on how their love could overcome his betrayal, she would tell him, "You go to LA and do what you want to do. Let's see what happens." The ensuing 18-month period apart, which John later called his Lost Weekend, coincided with the creation of album Mind Games and was spent in the company of May Pang, who previously worked as the couple's personal assistant. May, who was just 23 years old at the time, was approached by her 40-year-old boss Yoko with the offer of having an affair with 33-year-old John. Yoko walked into my office and said, "John and I are not getting along and he's probably going to start going out with other people. I want you to go out with him." Compared to the unknown, for Yoko, May was safe, a quiet and demure girl she could more easily control. Although today May remembers the preceding relationship between herself and John very fondly, she initially was against it, describing John's first pass at her unfavorably. But Yoko ignored May's May's protest and promised that she would arrange everything. Albert Goldman would later state, Yoko herself had grown up watching her father nipping off to enjoy his geisha, so what could be more natural? John left with May for LA in October 1973 to promote Mind Games' album's release, but decided to extend their stay while living with lawyer Harold Sider, then film producer Lou Adler. It seemed the separation from Yoko drove him back to old friends for comfort, namely the other members of the Beatles. Mind Games was released in November 1973, as well as Ringo Starr's album that same month, in which John collaborated, specifically on the track I'm the Greatest. George even joined the two during the recording sessions for the song. This would mark the only period 3 former Beatles recorded together between the band's breakup and John's passing. There are rumors he often excitedly talked about the Beatles coming back together again and working on new music during this time. While this never happened, John and Paul did record together while partying at an LA studio in March 1974. This playful and unpolished taped recording would be labeled A Toot and Snore in 74 and also featured the likes of Stevie Wonder and Harry Nilsson jamming out with them. Around this time, the press would also capture John's acting out in alcoholic-fueled antics. 2 incidents in particular at the Troubadour Club made headlines. The first involved John getting into a brawl against a waitress with an unused sanitary pad stuck to his forehead. Just 2 weeks later, he and Harry Nilsson were thrown out of the club after picking a fight with the Smother Brothers and shouting obscenities during the live show. Photographer Brenda Mary Perkins tried to snap him, but an enraged John took a swing and his fist allegedly punched her right eye. A claim which John would dispute, saying she just wanted to get her name in the papers and a few dollars. John was drinking, but that was overblown in retrospect, said May. The press keeps repeating the same stories over and over. But merrier events would also unfold during his time at the club. Of note was his impromptu collaboration with Elton John following their recent studio work together on his next album, a memorable moment in both artists' careers. He also produced for other artists such as Harry Nilsson's Pussycats and Mick Jagger's Too Many Cooks Spoiled the Soup, which remained unreleased for over 30 years. In June, John and May moved into a newly rented penthouse in Manhattan where a spare room had been prepared for his son Julian, now 11 years old, to stay during visits. They'd been estranged from one another for 3 years, but an awkward call from Cynthia was the catalyst for recommunication. When the ship docked, John was waiting for us with May beside him. He was pale and gaunt and clearly nervous. He pecked me on the cheek, then scooped Julian into his arms and hugged him. Cynthia would go on to describe May as a sweet but slightly lost-looking girl. She chatted easily with me and was kind and sensitive towards Julian. John, on the other hand, still remained awkward and distant. His fluctuating moods continued to intimidate his son. I was furious with John for putting yet another barrier between himself and his son. He could be astoundingly insensitive and cruel and gave no thought to the consequence for their relationship, but none of this stopped Julian worshipping him, as he was delighted when his father mentioned having him again in the summer. In October 1974, he released Walls and Bridges, which featured several artists he collaborated with during his time in LA. Elton John provided backing vocals on the track Whatever Gets You Through the Night, which became John's first solo #1 hit, with #9 Dream following soon after. With Elton's Thanksgiving concert at Madison Square Garden in November, John surprised him on stage for a duet of new and old songs from his Beatle days, introducing I Saw Her Standing There as a song by an old estranged fiancé of mine called Paul. Elton would go on to top the Billboard charts with his rendition of the Beatles' Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, with John acting as his guitarist and background vocalist. All through their separation, Yoko made an effort to remain in contact. According to May, Yoko was calling 10 to 15 times a day wanting to know what was going on. I felt awful and I told John that. Paranoid about her public image and not wanting word out on their separation, Yoko gave orders on how May and John should comport themselves in public, demanding that they travel in separate cars and that May continue the pretense of only being John's secretary, going as far as to send close informants like DJ and interviewer Elliot Mins to gather info on what was happening between her husband and his new girl. It's unclear if Yoko had intended for their separation to last that long. By December 1975, May and John were weighing up purchasing a home together, and with a growing desire for personal improvement, John was also trying to quit smoking. He must have discussed it with Yoko, as during one of her phone calls she offered to help him quit through a process of hypnosis. May recalls he went to meet with her, promising to return in time to take her out to dinner. I had a strange feeling, a premonition that something was not going the right way. She waited and waited, but he never returned. Later, he would inform her when she tried to call that his separation from Yoko was over, though the two would continue to see each other unofficially even until his passing. David Bowie and John's collaboration project Fame was released in January 1975, with John acting as the background guitarist and vocalist. It quickly became Bowie's first US #1. John's album Rock and Roll, featuring his rendition of songs, was released the following month. Stand By Me specifically was a hit in both the UK and the US market, but it would be his last single for 5 years. The release was followed with his last stage appearance on the ATV special, A Salute to Sir Lou Grade, recorded in April but televised in June. His focus on his growing family caused John to take a complete pause from the limelight, though Yoko would later publicly admit in a 1980s radio interview that they relapsed in drug use several times during the 70s. This also marked a period where the couple was least dependent compared to the years prior. On the 9th of October 1975, his and Yoko's only child, Sean Taro Ono Lennon, was born at Weill Cornell Medical Center in Manhattan, New York. The day also marked John's 35th birthday. Yoko, who was quite into the occult, was said by John to have planned the conception, believing that if a child was born on its father's birthday, it would receive its father's soul when he dies, and she so wanted a child that would inherit John's genius. Yoko had suffered several miscarriages during their marriage, the first in 1968, another in 1969, and a third almost a year after. We got back together, decided this was our life, that having a baby was important to us, and that anything else was subsidiary to that, John later told the press. We worked so hard for that child. We went through all hell trying to have a baby, through many miscarriages and other problems. He's what they call a love child in truth. Although Sean was the second child of both his parents, who each had a child from their previous marriages, this would be John's first, which he planned for at a time in his life where he could better take on such a responsibility. John called me when Sean was a month old and asked me to take some photos for his family, said photographer Bob Gruen. He seemed happier than I'd ever seen him and was looking forward to spending all his time raising his new son. John would dedicate 5 years to utter domestic bliss instead of touring for months at a time at the precipice of his career when Julian was born. Rising at 6 a.m. daily to plan out his meals, baking bread and doting after the baby while Yoko managed the business side of things instead of long hours away at studio recordings and press interviews. I wanted to give 5 solid years of being there all the time. I hadn't seen my first son Julian grow up, and now there's a 17-year-old man on the phone talking about motorbikes. In fact, it seemed as if Sean marked the symbol of a new beginning for John, so much so that the past didn't seem to count as much. "It's John. I'm a father," Leon Wilds, his lawyer, recalled him saying. He was ecstatic, bouncing around his room as he spoke. Although promises were made, they were often cancelled, so Julian wouldn't get to meet his baby brother or see his father for 2 years after Sean was born. In the months following the birth, John allowed very few visitors to his home as he was paranoid they might spread germs. The joy is still there when I see Sean. He didn't come out of my belly, but by God, I made his bones because I attended to every meal and how he sleeps and the fact that he swims like a fish because I took him to the ocean. I'm so proud of all these things. He's my biggest pride. But old habits die hard, so all wasn't as picture perfect as it seemed, because even Sean would go on to state in Philip Norman's book, John Lennon, The Life. He was teaching me how to cut and eat steak, which was a mystery to me at age 4. I think it was that same night he got very upset with me, because of something I did very cheekily with the steak. He did wind up yelling at me very, very loudly to the point where he damaged my ear, and I had to go to the hospital. I remember I was lying on the floor and hurting, and him holding me and saying, I'm so sorry, I'm sorry. He did have a temper. Music became his part-time hobby during this period, writing and recording at home when he got flashes of inspiration. Beautiful Boy, which was written during this time, was about Sean. Free as a Bird and Real Love would later be used by the 3 surviving Beatles for the new tracks released as part of their mid-90s anthology reunion. Many more would resurface on 1998's John Lennon Anthology, a collection of previously unreleased recordings. He also returned to his earlier passion for drawing, creating a collection of whimsical and expressive artworks depicting scenes from his domestic life. Many would be published posthumously as Real Love, which featured collaborative drawings by him and Sean. In June 1980, he sailed from Newport, Rhode Island to Bermuda on a 43-foot sailboat named Megan J. The trip down there was hit by a strong storm that caused most of the crew to get seasick, leaving Lennon, who had only recently taken up sailing, to be in charge of the boat for 6 hours. The adventure inspired him. The time there was amazing. Fred and Sean and I were there on the beach, taping songs with this big machine and me just playing guitar and singing. He spent 3 weeks total at Bermuda in a home called Fairylands. The tranquil environment combined with a renewed sense of purpose and freedom created the perfect setting for writing and refining tracks for his upcoming album. John emerged from his 5-year-long hiatus in October 1980 with the initial release of single Starting Over. The following month he released Double Fantasy, an album co-created with Yoko. Although it was not received well initially, it seemed very much like a passion project, a musical autobiography featuring songs celebrating his love for his wife, new family, and reflecting on his experiences during his time away from the public eye. By late 1980, wrote Cynthia, Julian began to feel that there was a genuine breakthrough in his relationship with his father. He began to call Julian more often. It was as though with his creative juices flowing, he had woken up and realized his son needed him. It seemed his time away from the limelight as well as some acquired self-growth led him to prioritizing his relationship to family, fatherhood, and his first son more. In his own words, John would later state, you can't cheat kids. If you cheat them when they're children, they'll make you pay when they're 16 or 17 by revolting against you or hating you or all those so-called teenage problems. I think that's finally when they're old enough to stand up to you and say, what a hypocrite you've been all this time. You've never given me what I really wanted, which is you. The 8th of December 1980, just 3 weeks following his album release, started off as a day like any other. It began with a photo shoot for Rolling Stone magazine and photographer Annie Leibovitz, which created the famous image of a nude John wrapped around a fully clothed Yoko. A radio interview to RKO Radio Network's DJ Dave Sholin followed, where he expressed contentment with life and excitement for new music. Later that day, he and Yoko left their apartment for the Record Plant studio to record and work on some songs. And at around 5 p.m., a stranger who would come to be known as Mark David Chapman approached him in the street as an excited fan, handing over his copy of the Double Fantasy album, which John signed. At the Record Plant, the couple worked on mixing a track titled Walking on Thin Ice, a song they both believed had significant potential. The recording session went smoothly, with John in high spirits, joking with the studio staff before leaving for home at around 10:30 p.m. At 10:50, a limousine dropped the couple off at the Dakota building where they were residents. Yoko made her way towards the lobby while John collected cassettes of the day's recordings and a few pieces of equipment.
Mr. Lennon.
For the second time that day, Mark David Chapman would approach him again at the entrance of their apartment, emerging out of the late-night shadows like a ghoul. I knew what I was doing, and I knew it was evil, Chapman later revealed at a subsequent parole hearing. My big answer to everything was, I wasn't going to be a nobody anymore. He fired 5 shots at close range, hitting John twice in the shoulder and twice in the back, missing his 5th as John began to slump while climbing up the Dakota stairs. Yoko, in a state of shock and horror, screamed for help. The building's porter, who knew John well, covered him with his jacket, then quickly called for emergency assistance. They arrived within minutes. Deciding there was no time to wait for an ambulance, John was rushed in a police cruiser to the emergency room of Roosevelt Hospital, where he was pronounced dead on arrival at 11:15 p.m. due to immense blood loss at just 40 years old. Chapman did not make any attempt to flee the scene or resist arrest, for an act he decided was the will of God and had planned out for 3 months prior. At first, he fully embraced his desired status of infamy. Chapman later expressed envy towards John, saying, I thought by killing him, I would acquire his fame. He also expressed rage at what he perceived to be John's phoniness as motivations behind his crime. He told us to imagine no possessions, and there he was with millions of dollars and yachts and farms and country estates, laughing at people like me who had believed the lies and bought the records and built a big part of their lives around his music. I would listen to his music and I would get angry at him for saying that he didn't believe in God and that he just believed in him and Yoko and he didn't believe in the Beatles. In later hearings, he revealed he'd only killed John out of convenience and had a hit list of other potential targets, all featuring famous figures such as Paul McCartney, Elizabeth Taylor, Ronald Reagan, John Carson, Hawaiian Governor George Ariyoshi, Jacqueline Kennedy, and more. The news of Lennon's death spread rapidly, sending shockwaves around the world. Hundreds of fans gathered outside his apartment chanting his songs, which were being played on every radio station. Yoko issued a statement the next day saying, "There's no funeral for John. John loved and prayed for the human race. Please do the same for him." She had his remains cremated less than 24 hours after his death at Ferncliff Cemetery in Hartsdale, New York, and scattered his ashes over Central Park where the Strawberry Fields Memorial was later created. Starting Over and the double fantasy album topped the charts in the UK and the US. Imagine hit number 1 in the UK in January 1981, and Happy Xmas peaked at number 2. Imagine was succeeded at the top of the UK charts by Woman, the second single from Double Fantasy. Roxy Music's cover version of Jealous Guy, recorded as a tribute to John, also became a UK number 1. A 17-year-old Julian would later recount to Cynthia how he and Yoko explained John's death to 5-year-old Sean. In the end, we both talked to him. We told him Daddy was dead, and when he finally understood, he burst into tears, and I cuddled him. I told him the man who killed our dad would go to court. Sean said, "Do you mean a tennis court or a basketball court?" I said, "No, it's a different kind of court." Ignoring his lawyer's advice, Mark David Chapman pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 20 years to life. 6 days after his assassination, Yoko requested a 10-minute silence vigil on the 14th of December to allow fans a moment to reflect on John's life, his contributions to music, and rallies for peace. The vigil was scheduled for 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and people from different corners of the globe globe heeded her call, with hundreds of thousands gathering in public squares, at parks and other significant locations to pay their respects. Many brought flowers, candles, and handwritten notes, creating makeshift memorials to express their grief and gratitude. In Liverpool, John's hometown, fans congregated in St. George's Plateau and other landmarks associated with his early life and the Beatles' history. Similar gatherings took place in cities like London, Tokyo, Sydney, and many others. Media coverage of the vigil was extensive, with news outlets broadcasting scenes of the gatherings. Even till today, John's image as well as his music and his words continue to influence popular culture. In his short life, he still managed to live so much. Thanks for listening.